Hey, welcome everybody. You're listening to Pasture Poultry Talk. This is episode 107. And today we're going to dig into your brooder. We're going to continue the Pasture Poultry training series. About midway through here, we're going to focus on those first critical days, first critical weeks, known as your brooder, the mama hen phase, right? So here's something I want you to think about as we dive into this topic. If you're raising meat birds, Cornish cross, Freedom Ranger, something like that, consider that meat bird may spend 40% of its life in a brooder environment, right? That's a meat bird processed at 7 weeks. Obviously, the longer you grow, the less that percentage comes. But a laying hen, by comparison, only spends 5 to 7% of its first year laying cycle in a brooder. That's five weeks in the brooder out of 70 weeks of age. But the brooder importance comes down to more than just time. It's about developing nutrition and appetite and starting that chick off with the healthiest life possible. You're literally establishing the success of that chicken or turkey or duck or whatever you happen to be raising for the rest of its life. It's hard to make up the mistakes in the brooder, and you mess up in the brooder at your own risk. And we all make mistakes. We all do things that could be do better. So we're going to focus on kind of getting our birds off to the right start and keeping an eye on those things that really create the most havoc in our production. And before we do that, let's go ahead and check in on our sponsors and thank them graciously. I'd like to thank show sponsor Windy Meadows Hatchery. Windy Meadows is down there in North Texas, and they supply pasture poultry farmers with day-old broiler chicks from their family-owned hatchery in Northeast Texas. Windy Meadows Hatchery brings a family scale and a family touch to the day-old broiler chick business. And I just love that I can talk to Benjamin directly and, have a conversation with the people who hatch and pack the chicks on a regular basis. It's pretty cool. It's great. It's part of what being a family type of business is all about. And I talked to Benjamin recently here about their supply in the hatchery. And then, as we go into summer here, the summer of 2020, the supply is kind of moderating a little bit. There's a lot of people, especially down there where he's at, that's not necessarily raising chickens, meat birds in the summer, in the heat of the summer. So at least for Windy Meadows Hatchery, the demand is kind of eased up a little bit. So that means you can get chicks there if you need them. So give them a call. I recommend you give them a call if you're in need of day-old broiler chicks at a competitive price. And don't wait till the last minute because there's still a little bit of lead time, right? You can always call and say, hey, I got an emergency, but plan ahead a little bit. Give them a call. See what they have. I'm certain that they can help you out. To find out some more about them, visit pasturepoultrytalk.com/WMH and tell them Mike Badger sent you. And this episode of Pasture Poultry Talk is also brought to you by Premier One Supplies. Premier has been supplying electric fencing and electric netting, sheep and goat supplies, poultry products and supplies, and the expert advice to use it all for over 40 years. I remember I purchased my first fence about 10 years ago when I started. I still use Premier fences. I still shop and order them and believe that they are the best brand fence in the industry. When it comes to the Premier poultry net, it's lightweight, it's easy to move, and it deters ground predators when it's properly energized. It can literally protect your bottom line by keeping your flock safer. And Premier also supplies a variety of energizers to meet those needs. Best of all, they provide a very memorable shock to keep the foxes and the raccoons at bay. So if you're looking for fences that work from the people who use them every single day, contact Premier at 800-282-6631 or visit pasturepoultrytalk.com/Premier. And Premier is spelled Premier. Get your informational catalog. Tell them Mike Badger at Pasture Poultry Talk sent you. Now let's go ahead and jump into our brooder. So I'm going to assume that we're brooding inside a building. Most of us, especially if you're just starting out in pasture poultry, you're just going to have some kind of probably a wood structure, maybe a metal building, some kind of fixed building that doesn't really have a lot of environmental controls in it. It might have windows, hopefully it has windows and ventilation. things like that. But you're not running a temperature controlled environment, for example. And I'm not going to deal with pasture brooding. I don't do pasture brooding. I don't really necessarily find it an attractive thing. Some people do, and that's fine. But I just don't. So I can't speak really to it very well. We are going to talk about timing the brooder. We're going to talk about keeping it warm, the basics there. Brooder space that you may need, feeding, watering. We'll touch a little bit on that. Bedding, ventilation and airflow, predators. That's a fairly good slate of topics. Won't take us too long to get through it, I don't think. Let's talk a little bit about time, because if you're running any kind of production schedule, you're going to be scheduling birds to come in at intervals, perhaps, and you're going to need to have resources available for when those birds come out. And so a couple opinions based on what I do and based on what lots of other folks do. Here's some time in the brooder. So broilers, Cornish cross meat birds, I go 3 weeks. Freedom Rangers, I usually take the 4 weeks. That's just the way it is. Some people will cut that out by a week, depending on season, time of year, whatever. I do 3 weeks, pretty standard fare there. Freedom Rangers, I do 4. Turkeys, I feel 6 weeks is the minimum number that a broad-breasted turkey should stay in the brooder. If I have heritage Poults, I'm probably going to keep them in there till 8 weeks, just because they're a little more vulnerable when they're younger. They're a little smaller, and I would just want that protection for them. And they're going to stay on heat a little longer anyway. So 6 to 8 weeks for the turkey Poults. If I got layers or heritage birds in there, I'm going to brood them more than likely for 6 weeks, maybe 8 weeks, depending on the time of year, but at least through that initial starter phase, which is 6 weeks, because they're still pretty small when they come out of that stage. So if you don't have a good housing environment when you go out to pasture at 6 weeks, there's no glory in forcing that, because you're going to put them at risk of predations. But as you get experience and as you adjust for your climate, region, and personality and ideals and whatever, you'll find things that work. What you don't want to do is rush these birds to pasture, especially in the edge of the seasons, like the big early seasons or the late seasons. If you're in places that have cold weather, there's just no value, no benefit to pushing birds out of the brooder before they're ready, before the environment's ready, before the birds are actually capable of handling the outside that you're going to put them in. All of these recommendations that I follow have a contingency plan for weather. If birds are 3 weeks and I look at the weather and I got a line of thunderstorms coming in, or I got a cold front moving in, or whatever, take your pick. I got rain scheduled. The birds aren't going out. They're going to stay in the brooder where they're protected, because I don't want their first nights on pasture to be volatile weather. I want that to be as calm as possible. Sometimes you can't help that. It happens. You get caught by surprise. You have no choice sometimes. But if you have the choice and you're planning, you don't want that to happen. You want to protect them. One of the other things you'll plan for is heat. Right? You want to be able to heat up your brooder to keep them warm, because chicks, part of what you're doing is mimicking the mama hen here and giving, in a natural environment, if a hen was hatching her brood of chicks, those chicks would be running around shore, but they'd be coming up under the mama hen and tucked up under her wing and staying warm that way. And the hen would be keeping them warm and protected. And so that's our goal here. And little chicks, little Poults, can't regulate their own body temperature. That's why they need the heat. So common heat sources that you're going to want to think about. The most common option is you go to the farm supply store and you buy those little silver heat lamps. They come with you can put 125 or 250 watt red bulb in them. They suspend them from the ceiling. They're universal. You can find them anywhere you look where chick stuff is sold. I won't tell you not to use them. I still actually use them on a regular basis. but they are a fire hazard. They are a barn burner. I remember a couple years ago, Patricia Foreman wrote me a story for the Apogrit, and she was talking about the dangers of those heat lamps. And she was arguing and making a case for a hover style of brooder heat, and cited fire hazards and actual fires as one of the reasons you don't want to use those systems. And then lo and behold, that following spring, one of our members told me that they had a barn fire due to one of those things. So it does happen. All I can say is if you're going to use those things, secure them, wire them, attach them to the ceiling. Make sure that if something happens, like if one thing fails, they can't hit the litter, right? So just protect them, leave the guards in place, do your best to make sure that they're not going to be capable of landing on the bedding and lighting it up. The other piece of advice here is, regardless of the number of birds, you should always have backup heat, right? So if you have 25 birds, you can get away with one lamp usually for that, but you should have two, because if one goes out, you want the backup heat source. Woe is the morning when you wake up in a cool morning where you had one heat lamp and everything was fine when you went to bed, and when you sometime over the night, the bulb blew out, and now you have no heat, and you have cold chicks, and that causes its own kind of problems. And on these heat lamps, Premier One, show sponsor, has some variations of these heat lamps that you would get at the common metal ones. They have one called a Prima heat lamp. It's a plastic, has a guard on it. They have some stands, they have four legs, so it's more sturdy to suspend something from them. And they have a couple different options there for heating. So it might be worthwhile to check them out too and see what they have. That's Premier One. You can find out information by visiting pasturepoultrytalk.com/premier. One thing that's really good for people just starting out is the Ohio Brooder. An Ohio Brooder is basically a hover type of brooder. I caught myself just mixing words here. I often describe the whole environment as a brooder, but sometimes when you're talking, you'll hear people use brooder in relation to just the heat area. And that's what I just did. I just referred to the heat, the warm area as the brooder. So it gets a little confusing, but just know that that's out there. I typically try to use brooder to mean the whole space, and then heat to recognize and describe the area where the chicks get the warmth, the warmest part of it. So the Ohio Brooder here is a good choice. It's easy to build. You can usually 1 or 2 sheets of plywood, a couple bulbs, and the way it works is you create a box that sits above the floor, and you can either use cinder blocks, or some people you suspend them with chains from the ceiling. And the lights are on either side of either end of the brooder box, of the Ohio Brooder. And the idea is you're heating from either end, and the heat stays trapped inside of that brooder, inside of that hover. And so the chicks, and they're little, they just run in and out of there, and they can regulate. They can go into under the heat when they're cold, and they can come out when they are warm enough and want to explore and run around and cool down a little bit. And they're really easy to build. You can Google them and find them. If you just Google Ohio Brooder, you'll find designs, ideas, conversations about how to build one. I'll try to link one in the show notes, but it was a design created and popularized by the Ohio Experiment Station, which is back in the 40s-ish, 1940s, that is. Last century stuff. How about that? And of course, there's other options for your heat source. You can use propane hovers, but if you're just starting out, you're more than likely not going to be talking and using propane hovers, because that's stuff you use when you're you start to brood, 4, 5, 600 or more chicks at a time. So a couple rules of thumb with your heat. You often hear it phrased this way. Start your chicks at 95 degrees and reduce it by 5 degrees a week until you get to the ambient temperature. And that sounds great. Woo, that sounds wonderful. But what if your ambient temperature is 40 degrees? It's going to take you a lot of weeks to get down to 40 degrees from 90. What if your ambient temperature is 90 or 95, right? You'll be at ambient temperature right from the get-go. So more practical advice here is to start at 95, reduce it. And if you're using a heat lamp, you reduce the heat by lifting the heat lamp up off of the floor, right? You raise the level of it, and that creates a cooler area underneath the heat. Same thing with like an Ohio brooder. And so when you do this, when you place birds in your brooder under the heat, you should observe them and watch them. And this is beyond your chore time. So you come in, you feed, you water, they're going to get all scrambled up and they're going to move around. They're going to do all kinds of crazy things. And you can't judge anything that they do based on that, because you just disturb them and ruin their whatever they were doing before. So you got to sit down, let them get back to what they were doing before you intervened, and watch them. And this actually, if you can build a brooder environment that has a place to observe your chicks without going into the brooder and actually disturbing them, that's all the better for you, because you can actually see what's going on before you enter the building or enter the actual brooding space. So what you're observing is how the chicks are behaving. If the chicks, if you have a heat lamp hanging there and all the chicks are piled in directly underneath that heat lamp, you're way too cold. You need more heat in your environment, because they're trying to get all huddled under that heat. And what they're going to do is smother each other, right? They're first of all, they're not getting the warmth they need to thrive. And if it's too cold, they're going to trample each other and suffocate each other. And it doesn't take very long for a couple ounce chick at 1 or 2 days old to smother when it's on the bottom of the pile. Poults, you'll lose a lot of poults this way too if you don't watch your heat. So that's what you're looking for there. But if the chicks are, pushed all the way out, like they're to the edges of your brooder, and they're kind of evenly distributed around the edge of your brooder, as far out as they can get away from the heat, you're too hot. So you need to cool it down, because they're trying to get away from that heat, and you can stunt them and cause problems by being too hot. So being too hot is not good. Being too cold is not good. That this is where having a thermometer maybe at the chick level, on the bedding level, will help you judge the temperature, but it's only a judge. It's only a starting judge, because what we know, and what actually David Hale talked about when we were in the APA conference in Jacksonville last year, was he was troubleshooting this idea where he kept turning up the heat. He set his temperature, kept turning up the heat and turning up the heat. And the brooder was getting so hot, the heat, but the chicks kept acting so cold. And what he discovered through his reading and research was that temperature is actually affected by the humidity, like how it feels. So he was in a very dry humidity, right? Meaning there wasn't a lot of humidity. It's very dry. And so in that environment, he needed more heat. He needed more than 95 degrees to make the chicks comfortable. So if you had a very humid environment, then your temperature may actually be less than 95 that you need from day one. So getting that rule of thumb is great, but you look at your birds and figure out what they're doing. And know that your chicks, your little itty bitty meat chicks, can't really regulate their body temperature until they're 10 days old or so. In that 10 to 14 days, they start to have some ways to cope with their body temp. When it comes to temperature itself, and one thing you often see people talk about or ask the question about is their meat birds are not feathered out. Being poorly feathered is a sign that you might have kept it too warm in your brooder for too long. And that's kind of counterintuitive, especially if you're just starting out and you have cool weather or whatever. You think they need more heat, but the reality is, as you get past that 10 days, you want to get that heat off of them. Your goal should be to get them off of heat as soon as possible and ready to go outside, because you don't want to. Here's the other danger that people make. They'll run heat on their chicks all the way through 3 weeks, 21 days. And then you see the question becomes, well, do I need to put heat on in the pasture because they have heat in the brooder? And the answer to that is no, you don't put heat in your pasture shelter. What a logistical nightmare. I'm looking to have heat off so that in that last week from 14 to 21 days or from 10 to 21 days, I want to be able to open up the windows, open up the doors, and let the birds experience the ambient temperatures as much as I possibly can. I want to get them as acclimated as possible to what the environment is outside so that when they go outside, it's not a complete shock to them. Now, when it comes to turkeys, they kind of start off the same way. They're looking at 95 degrees or so. You can reduce temperature 5 degrees per week till you get the ambient temperature. I typically brood turkeys in July and August, which is a sweat factory here. It's hot, it's humid. We're probably 90, high 80s, 90 here in Pennsylvania, but it's humid. But nevertheless, don't let that fool you, because turkeys like the heat. So I normally would keep heat on my turkeys for 3 to 4 weeks, depending on what's happening with the weather outside. 4 weeks is not unheard of. And if you're doing the math there, so 4 weeks, you're going to drop the temperature by 20 degrees. So you'll never, if you follow the rule of thumb here and you start out at 95 and you drop it 5 degrees a week, then you should be at 75 degrees. And that might cover you at night, but it's still going to be 85 or 90 during the day. But still, it's okay to lift that heat up. And if it's hot outside, I turn my heat off during the day and I let them, have that, or I turn half the heat off or something like that. The goal is this, to watch them and be observant and to know what they're doing. But your turkeys, start weaning them off of heat at 4 weeks. I get them out of the brooder at 6 and they're on pasture. They're good size at 6. That's when I sell started poults, which I'm currently doing as of recording this podcast. I still have some started poults available that I raise to 6 weeks, and then they're available for pickup. That's when everybody clears out. So they get picked up by people, and the ones I keep go out to pasture. So how big of a brooder do you actually need? Let's talk a little bit about the space requirements of different of chickens and turkeys in your brooder, and start with the chickens first. Meat chicks, the easiest one, and layers kind of can follow this, but they're a couple weeks behind in their growth of the fast growing meat bird. So you can take that as a starting point. But anyway, meat birds, I typically recommend 1 square foot of space per chick. That's a lot of real estate, but that realistically will take you to 4 weeks. So there's a little bit of slack built in. If you want a better guide, then you can kind of budget a 1/4 square foot of space per chick per week. So if you're going to 3 weeks, you have 3/4 of a square foot. And it gives you some room, right? That's a roomy space for your chick to hang out and to live life. Here's what those numbers give you. They give you insurance. So if you're trying to cut space back because you don't have the space and you want to run a larger batch, or you just don't know, or you're following somebody's internet wisdom because it works for them, that's okay. But just know that that idea of 1 square foot per chick is about having a little bit of insurance. And I generally don't necessarily keep that space on all my batches. Some of the smaller ones I do, but sometimes when I push 100 birds or 150 birds, I can't keep 1 square foot. And I can tell when I don't do it because I have a hard time managing my bedding when I get into that 3rd week, that that time between 14 and 21 days. Part of having the insurance here is we don't have an investment in environmentally controlled buildings. So managing the ventilation, the humidity, the things that really affect air quality and the litter quality, we don't have those at our disposal. So we're very passive in our environment, and having that extra space gives you some comfort in that passivity. And it also gives you some margin when you can't move your chicks out because it's raining or there's a cold front coming through and you got to hold them for an extra week. Now you can hold them for an extra week and you're still in good shape. You're not pushing your density of your brooder too high. So turkeys, that if I'm taking your turkeys to 6 weeks, probably 1.5 square foot, maybe 2 if you're really luxurious. It gives you lots of room to manage your birds and lets them have especially in that heat, it's easier to manage your brooder environment. And we'll talk a little bit about the brooder environment here as in terms of the ventilation and airflow, but just know that all these birds, like especially the heavy meat birds that you're going to raise, they will get to a point where they start dropping a lot of manure. And if you're not on top of that bedding and changing it and keeping it dry, that's when you get wet bedding and litter that's, becomes manure and it's got a big manure pack on it. And that's the nastiness that we get in our brooder. And that's the brooder environment that sets us up for, disease, stomach problems, gut type of problems. Other thing that comes into play with space, and I can tell you what I do in terms of the corners and just giving the environment. Like some people will actually cordon off a smaller space for their poults and keep them contained into a tighter group. I don't tend to do that too much. I don't even, for my meat birds and my layers, I don't even round my corners. The common wisdom is to round your corners because if they get into the corners, they will pile. If they spook or get some other kind of environmental thing causes them to go to the corners and pile up, the chicks at the bottom of that corner will suffocate very easily. I just haven't had a lot of problems with that over the years, so I don't round my corners. You may. I mean, it is the popular thing, and don't do it. Don't choose not to round your corners because I don't. That rounding your corners is a very sage advice, but I think part of this is because I don't confine my initial brooder environment down to that 1/4 square foot space kind of idea. I give them the full brooder space to work in, and that buys me a little bit of insurance. I don't have to worry about the corners, if that makes sense. Now for turkeys are a different animal. And that's probably the number one piece of advice I have for you with turkeys is they're not chickens. They're different. But turkeys, I do round corners, and I round the corners using a trick that Eli Reif taught me a couple years ago when we did a co-presentation at PASA, which was to put hay in the corners. Just take a couple handfuls of hay and you put it in the corner and you kind of ramp it up the corner. So the idea then is as your poult goes in the corner, as they pile, those first birds are going to go up the hay pile and they're going to be sitting on top. and all the turkey poults that come in after and pile, they're stacking up. Instead of being under the pile, they're walking up the hay to be on top of the pile. I don't know if I did a good job of describing that, but seriously, just put some hay in the corner and make a little ramp, and that's your rounded corner. Very easy for turkeys. Okay, feed and water. Talked a lot about feeding in episode 106 and kind of what the chicks need and how they need it and things like that. So feed, just to reiterate, your observation here is all chicks eat at the same time. That's your gold standard. That's what you measure. That's what you shoot for. One thing that I do differently here in the initial feeding is simply to use paper plates for the first couple of days and just put a bunch of paper plates, in and around the heat. Like those first couple of days, I want the water and the food to be right on the edge of heat. Like if at all possible, I want them to be able to eat and drink without leaving the heat. But I also want the food and water to be accessible, if they go out of the heat, if they're too hot and they go to cool off and stuff. I want them to be able to get to the food too without being in the heat, if that makes sense. So accounting for both scenarios there, but my first 48 hours of feeding is going to be on paper plates. So I'm just going to put a bunch of paper plates in the brooder and sprinkle some feed on there and let the birds walk on it, scratch on it, discover it, and find it wherever they walk. And that's really what I want them to do. Then I'll switch to a turbo feeder. That's the red feeder with the yellow base. Holds about 10 pounds of feed. Real shallow lip, but they don't splash out in the top of the feeder twists, so you can, when the feed bridges and sticks, you can knock it down. But that and use that for up until about 10 days, probably max. The birds start to get a little bit too big for them, usually after 10 days. But they're nice. They're a nice first feeder because they're shallow, they're easy to access, and they hold a good amount of feed. And then at that point, I usually transition to a trough style feeder. Now with water, same thing. Keep that water in and around the heat so they can get to it if they're in the heat or from without the heat. And more than one is good in all situations. You can't have too many water stations. Just make sure it's clean and accessible. That's the key points, because as I talked about in 106, the water consumption is going to drive your feed consumption. So they need to be able to drink so they can eat. And if you're feeding grit at this stage, and you should be, there's nothing wrong with feeding us your grit, day 2, day 1, even. I'm not a big opponent to feeding from day 1. What I'll typically do though is day 2 or 3, whenever I get them off of the paper plates, is I'll get the starter grit and I'll top dress in my feeders, and just so they get some grit right away. And if, depending on the year and what I'm doing, I might have a separate feeder with grit in them. But typically in the brooder, I'm just going to grab a handful and toss it into my feeders and let them consume it as part of their just normal behavior. No, I don't find that they go out of their way to eat a lot of grit, but I'm going to just toss a few handfuls, a handful into the feeder at feeding time. Let it work in like that. One of the other kind of fundamental points of your brooder here is the bedding. This is a pretty important piece. I only have experience with 2 types of bedding, so that's all I'm going to talk about here. Actually 3. I'll talk about a negative experience, but either kiln dried shavings that you buy in the plastic bales from your hardware store or from your feed store or whatever. That's one very good source. Peat moss is another good source. A little dusty, but it's birds love it. They will dust bathe easily in it, and you end up using about the same amount of bedding dollar-wise, whether you use peat moss or the shavings. You'll use less peat moss, but peat moss is more expensive than you will the shavings. And if you're going to use the shavings, just put a nice layer in there of 4 or 6 inches deep. And then if you're going to use the peat moss, you really don't need much more than, a 1/4 of an inch in there. But what a lot of people do is they'll put a base of shavings down, and then they'll put peat moss on top of that. And what I like about the peat moss is that it seems to be a little bit more absorbent than the shavings. It's also kind of a more sterile option, and it can go right onto your compost or right onto your garden, right out of the brooder, whereas your pine shavings cannot. They got to go through a composting process. So one of the things that I learned in the brooder is that bedding management really is critical. The day I started carrying a rake in there, or a shovel, or basically a rake. I was raking around my waterers to get any wet, clumping litter out and replace it with something dry. The day I did that, my brooding success went way up. And it's not a big task, because you're especially in the first couple of weeks, you're not going to have hardly anything to do other than those high impact areas around the feed and water. You just scratch it up and add fresh in there. If they got clumps, pull it out. And that little bit of maintenance, I swear, was what took me from being, brooder being one of the most mediocre things that I do, to brooding being fairly successful and repeatable. So highly encourage you. Keep that rake in there as a reminder. I always prop it up in the corner so it's there. I see it and I use it. Because one of the things that happens is, you listened to me just a couple minutes ago talk about giving your meat birds especially, 1 square foot of space per chick. And you're going to say that's too high. You're going to put 50 birds in a metal stock tank for 3 weeks, and you're going to wonder why the bedding is like matted poop. And it's not going to be absorbent, and there's no amount of scratching that's going to keep that clean. So that's a problem. You should never do that to the way I just described it. So I can't tell you how to fix it other than don't do it. But what happens is if you are crowding birds, if you're stocking a dense birds, and let's say you have your birds at a half a square foot and they're 3 weeks old or 2.5 weeks old, they're almost ready, but they're about a half a square foot or a third a square foot or something like that, which is a common number. And what you start seeing is your bedding becomes just constantly, the birds turn on the manure in that time, and they're just dropping so much more than what they are, in the first week and a half of their life. And next thing you know, there's just you're scratching, you're trying to put new bedding in, but the new bedding's only lasting for, half a day. It's tough. And that's a sign that something in your brooder is off. In a perfect world, you might be able to theoretically run a denser brooder environment than that, but you better pay attention to ventilation, which we'll get to here in just a second. And you better pay attention to some of the other things like the litter management. The quality of that litter, which is what your birds live on. Your birds are living on that litter. Litter is the bedding plus their poop. It's all combined, and the purpose of the bedding is to absorb that manure that the birds put down and keep a dry environment. I didn't lead with this, but your mantra in the brooder is clean, dry, and warm. Clean, dry, and warm. And if you can keep your brooder clean, dry, and warm, man, you're off to the right start. And everything else is gravy, baby. So let's talk about the ventilation right now, since we segued in there a little bit. Ventilation is important. Ventilation is basically air exchange. You pull fresh air from the outside and you bring it in, and you replace the used up air inside your brooder. And that has to happen at certain rates. And you can look at any commercial, if you raise commercial meat birds, you can look at any commercial management guide, whether it's for layers or meat birds or turkeys, and you can find ventilation requirements for the birds. And it's marvelous stuff. It goes by the weight of the birds, by temperature, by the square footage of the building, all kinds of neat, interesting stuff. You're probably not there yet, so we're not going to talk about that. Those are some of the conversations that happen with the experienced producers at the APA conference that we hold every year. And David Hale, again, gave some really great training on ventilation in his his 2 years ago when we were in Texas, which was really great. I actually wrote an article for the Grid about it. But for our purposes, just know that ventilation is replacing the air inside the brooder with fresh air, and it has to happen. Under no circumstances should you ever close off the ventilation in your brooder. Usually what happens, and I say that because what happens is, it might be March or it might be September or October or November, and you're brooding chicks and it's cold. So what's your first tendency? Your first tendency is to make sure that every open area of your brooder building is sealed up, tighter than a drum. But what you're doing is you're blocking air off from coming in. You're blocking that fresh air from coming in, and you're not exchanging it. And that air then will eventually turn bad. It will become bad air. I mean, imagine going into your bathroom with every occupant of your house, whether that's 2 people, 3 people, or 7 people. Put everybody in your house, shut the door, shut the windows, turn off the exhaust fan, and just live in there. And see how long it takes you for the air to become stuffy, for your living functions to influence the environment you're in. You'll get an idea of what that's like. If you've ever spent time locked in a non-ventilated space, we're in the middle of COVID-19. What's one of the concerns that people have? It's about ventilation. Poorly ventilated spaces is really, really bad for a respiratory virus, right? It kind of makes sense. So it's the same deal for your chickens. If you have a poorly ventilated brooder space, it's going to cause issues for your chickens. And those issues, if you ever smell ammonia, your birds are hosed. It's already too late. You're already causing lots of damage. You can correct it. You can correct the ammonia, but you've already caused damage. But ammonia starts to happen when you have poor air quality, which turns the poor litter quality, and you have that buildup of manure, that excess nitrogen is becoming ammonia. Like that's the connection that you have when in that thing. And then, that ammonia is causing performance problems. They're not gaining weight as they should. You're going to, damage lungs. You're going to damage the respiratory tract, making susceptible to disease, respiratory diseases. Now your air quality is off, and now your litter is going to be off, and now you're going to have that buildup, and now you're going to be susceptible to coccidiosis or necrotic enteritis, which are those most common gut issues that we see in the brooder, and it all stems from poor air quality. And so, best thing to do is always keep air flowing into your brooder. And like I said at the beginning of this, oftentimes we run these passive brooder environments, so airflow is not easy to manage. So sometimes you might have to put a fan in there, especially if it's in the middle of the summer and you're hot and humid. So you put that fan in there and you get on with life. And one of the things you kind of judge when you're evaluating your air quality, or some of those are things I mentioned, like the ammonia. If you smell ammonia, it's bad. Rectify it immediately. Litter quality is can be a sign of overstocking, or it can be a sign of poor air quality, which will be influenced by overstocking. But it's also when you you open the door to the brooder and you walk in there and it takes your breath away, or it's just immediately stale. That kind of stale blah air. That's a cue to you that you got something off that you can fix. Whether you can ultimately fix it or not is a different question and a different problem. But the first thing you got to do is recognize the issue. Whenever I talk about ventilation, I need to talk about drafts too, because in your brooder, you want to keep drafts away from your chicks. The drafts happen at the chick level. So that's air coming in from outside that's directly blowing on the birds. That's usually pretty bad. Oftentimes it'll be cooler, but they don't like that direct air coming in on them. and they're going to move away from it. And they usually pile when they have drafts that they can't escape. Your brooder should be draft free, but provide ventilation. So drafts, you protect drafts at the chick level, so at the bottom of the brooder, and the ventilation comes in from the top. And that's pretty simple. And as we talked about the bedding quality and humidity and things like that, so all these things come into play, and you just got to look at it all. You got to look at the whole context of your brooder and make observations, because here's something that I believe strongly. And the longer your birds are in the brooder, the less likely these things are to remain true. I believe, first of all, that if your brooder is doing well, you should sit in there and drink your coffee and eat your lunch sandwich. Should have no issues with it. It should be a pleasant place to hang out. It should be enjoyable. Drink your coffee, eat your sandwich. If you want to take it a step further, you should be able to lay down on the ground and stretch out and let the chicks run over your head, right? You shouldn't have any issue kind of just sitting down in your brooder and being one with your chicks. If those things aren't true, then you got a recognizable problem that you could fix. Whether or not you can fix them, that's a different story. That's a different question. But your brooder, it's not a foregone conclusion that your brooder should be a manure pit packed full of crap that stinks and is dirty. It gets that way sometimes, sure. But you shouldn't accept that as normal. You shouldn't accept that as the way that it is. It may be the way that you've seen it, but it's not the way that it's always done. And it's possible to do it better. So just be aware of that. That's my only point. Those are the evaluation points. And when you come up across those things, especially when you're just starting out, it's a learning curve. And in some cases, like me, I know these things. I can evaluate where things are going wrong, but I also have the wherewithal now with some experience behind me that I can manage the things that I know I'm deficient in. Like I'm deficient in brooder space. So if I run a larger batch of 150 birds, I know that I don't have enough optimum brooder space to take those birds to 3 weeks. So I gotta get them out at 2 weeks, which almost never happens, or I got to spend extra time in my brooder managing them. And that comes with a rake, that comes with the fan, that comes with just being diligent to do the best I can to give the extra effort. Because the extra effort, even if you're slipping a little bit, is better than no effort and slipping a lot. Okay, so let's move on to predators. I'm only going to cover I'll cover a couple predators here. The apex predator in the brooder, it sounds kind of weird to say it like this. The predator that you need to worry the most about is rats, especially if you have an older building or something like that. What I found with rats is they don't always show up. Like they were never here at this property until when we moved in. Well, actually they were, but we didn't see them. They weren't an issue until we started having animals, so we started having feed, so we started having those kind of things. Then the rats became more of an issue. But rats are the biggest issue in the brooder, hands down. You start seeing telltale signs of burrows around the perimeter of your brooder, like on the inside. Like walk your inside of your brooder, walk your outside of your brooder building, look for holes going in, look for tunnels or travel ways or poop or things like that. Those are signs. But also look for, if you have a rat attack, if you just have a couple rats, not a big problem, you're going to see, you never miss the chicks. You may never see the problem because you might only lose a handful of animals. And commonly they just disappear, right? The rats take the chicks and cart them off to their burrow. Sometimes you'll see a wing, only a wing left. Sometimes you'll see like a body that's been killed and gnawed around the neck or something like that. If it's a little bit bigger, those are pretty good signs you got a rat. And if you come in and if you place like 50 chicks in your brooder and you come in like 12 hours later and you've got 0 chicks left, chances are you do have a really serious rat problem that just wiped you out. I do set bait stations for rats and have them kind of running year round. I just don't want to deal with them. My brooders, when I do maintenance on my brooders, hardware cloth is usually the best way I found to seal up the holes, like a 1/4 inch hardware cloth, because they'll crawl through chicken wire pretty easily and they can squirrel through some really small holes. So that's how I get them. Sometimes if I have some I'm dealing with and I know they're there, I'll set a snap trap, a rat size snap trap where you just squeeze the one end and it locks the trigger. And then when the rat steps on the trigger, it just clamps down on its head. I'll set them, usually blind set them along a wall so that the trigger is facing the wall. So then, because the rats will naturally travel along the edges of the brooder. So if you just blind set, you don't have to use bait. You just set it there so that the rat has no choice but to walk across the trap as it travels. And that will catch a good number of rats. The other big predator sometimes you'll get is minks in your brooder, because they can fit into small places, and if you're near a waterway, they'll find their way in. They can decimate you. Normally, I don't have a lot of problem with minks. I had one year we had a mink, and it took out adult birds. It was in the wintertime, and they're coming in through a small hole, so we fixed them. Fixed the holes in the mink. Those are the two biggest brooder concerns I have. Feral cats, if you got feral cats, try to keep them out of there. A lot of times they're not an issue for various farms, especially if you got some rodents running around. But now the one thing I didn't cover here, and I had some questions. I actually reached out to Winnie Meadows to find out what kind of questions they commonly received about the brooder. I answered almost all of them in my episode here, with the exception of diseases. I touched on some of this, but I'm going to dig into coccidiosis. Like Benjamin at Winnie Meadows Hatchery said, get a lot of questions about coccidiosis. What can you tell me about it? And so here's what I can tell you about coccidiosis. Coccidiosis shows up in that 7 kind of 10-day range. It's a gut bacteria, and all your birds have coccidiosis naturally. Something happens to cause it to become out of balance. A telltale sign here is, a coccidiosis bird is oftentimes kind of the hunched over bird that looks like it's all scrunched up and just been yelled at and beaten, right? It has that kind of appearance. It's kind of just scrunched down. You also see manure that's got some blood in it and stuff like that. So coccidiosis, that's that 7-10 day window that it starts to show up. And the most likely reason for this is something with the bedding, something with the management of the brooder environment that's causing wet, damp bedding, or maybe you've got feed spillage, or they're eating feed off of that bedding, and you're contributing. You're creating the environment that causes that coccidiosis to become a problem. And the remedy, the prevention, is to keep the bedding dry, clean, warm, and dry, and you'll be golden. One of the old time recommendations that I received when I was raising pasture poultry, and it's actually in the Appa Green book, is, in 7 days, or actually a lot of people do it weekly. I know a lot of producers who still dose apple cider vinegar every week, add a 1 ounce of vinegar to a gallon of water. And they do it for a cocci preventative. And the cocci preventative, it works by, the apple cider vinegar is an acid. And so the acid in the gut creates an inhospitable environment for the cocci. That's how it works. And a lot of people swear by it. I don't disagree. I think it's good. Managing your bedding is the ultimate line of defense, but a little apple cider vinegar as a preventative dose, weekly, not going to hurt, going to help you. And of course, the next, as you age, if you don't fix that, then eventually you're going to have a necrotic enteritis is going to crop up. It's the same deal. But those are really the diseases you'll see. If you have really poor airflow, you're going to see respiratory diseases like we talked about. But if you got stuff showing up, first and foremost, recognize that it's a brooder environment issue. Unless something else happened that you're potentially cross-contaminating the birds in the brooder with, chicks from other sources. You're commingling unknown birds, which you should never, ever do. You should mention that your brooder, part of your disease prevention plan, your disease management plan here should be an all-in, all-out environment, right? So, and don't mix species. You do those things and keep your brooder clean, warm, and dry, and you don't even need to think about diseases in your brooder 99% of the time. That's what we have, folks. A lot of things to run through there. So cue it back up, listen again and again, and hear my voice, my soothed sounding voice. I'm actually recording this. This is a later episode in my recording. It's actually 11 o'clock at night as I finish up this sentence. And I'm going to go out and check my live bait trap to see if I caught a skunk. I'm really looking forward to catching a skunk that's been creating havoc in my layer flock. That's a different podcast. Anyway, folks, thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you picked up one or two things that will take you to another level, that will benefit your brooder experience. Don't underestimate the brooder. If you master one thing in your entire pasture poultry production, master the brooder phase, and it will pay dividends for the entire life of your birds. And with that, folks, have a great day. You can find more notes and information at pasturepoultrytalk.com/107. Thank you for listening.